Football fanatics, this is College Football with Sam, and we have a jam-packed show today on our hands, talking about the dominant performances by Ohio State, Penn State, Texas, and also Notre Dame in the first-round college football playoff games. The first ever 12-team college football playoff games commenced Saturday and one even on Friday night, and they were pretty boring, if I got to be honest, in terms of objective football. The most entertaining was Texas versus Clemson. I think the least entertaining was probably either Notre Dame versus Indiana or Penn State versus SMU. It would be one of those two. And Ohio State could be up there as well. Texas-Clemson really was the most entertaining out of all of them because in the fourth quarter, it was still a game. By the fourth quarter and all the other matchups, or well before then, the game was already very, very much decided. So we're going to talk about those games and ramifications for the 8 participants in those first-round games. And I also want to discuss who the remaining contenders are for the national championship, talk about the remaining field, and really rank the 8 remaining teams of the 12-team playoff in order of how good I think they are. I was originally going to talk about who has the best shot of winning it all, but that's different from who are the best teams in the playoff because of the imbalanced seeding, etc. And I will talk about that later this week. But today, I just want to talk about these games, talk about and discuss the remaining 8 teams in the playoff, ranking them from best to worst, and also give a little bit of some of my early analysis and thoughts on Oregon versus Ohio State, because I think that game is going to be epic and cinematic in its own way. Could be a historic matchup. It's certainly historic in terms of aesthetic. You have it on New Year's Day, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time, between the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes, who have been, especially in recent memory, the top-end programs in the Big Ten and former Pac-12 conference. So I'm very excited to talk about all of this. Remember, if you can, because I know many of you watch this show and probably think you are subscribed, but I don't know if you are, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you can be a part of the College Football with Sam community and also receive notifications when I go live like this or when I drop content. And also give the stream a like and be active in the chat. I am going to be bringing up throughout the video reminders for people to like and subscribe during every segment that's going to be cut, because I just think that's pretty useful, and there will be people coming in and out of the stream. So just bear with that. It's going to be very brief, but let's get down to the show. And toward the end of the show, I'll reserve 10-15 minutes to answer any questions that you guys have. As always, Super Chats take priority, but I'm going to try and answer the questions that I can. And also, thank you to our moderators in the chat, Hawk City and SFS Inverted, for being on here and really volunteering to make the channel even better than it already is. But let's start off the day talking about Friday night's game, Notre Dame and Indiana, which was ugly, to say the least. The Notre Dame Fighting Irish controlled the Indiana Hoosiers, and the game was not as close as the final score indicates. Notre Dame won 27-17 over an Indiana team that I thought was clearly outmatched. I was live for this game doing play-by-play commentary, and I took a lot of notes while going live, and really the biggest thing here, the biggest takeaway I have, and maybe it's an exaggeration, is never pick non-blue chip ratio teams, with rare exception. Of course, there are exceptions to all rules, but the fact that Indiana didn't have really any alien players to compensate for Notre Dame's home field advantage, talent advantage, to compensate for Indiana's rusty start while Notre Dame started faster, Indiana held up well in a lot of parts, and I still think they are a great team, but I clearly overvalued them, and the majority of the reasons why Notre Dame won I talked about in my deep dive, but again, I think I overvalued the Indiana Hoosiers here. Before we get into this game and matchup deeper and I give you some analysis, I just want to remind you all to subscribe to the channel, like the video, hit the notification bell, share this video around to other college football fans who love college football. Comment your reaction in the comment section below, and also join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And if you want to support the channel, the link to my Patreon page and my merchandise store are down in the video description and also in the pinned comment where you can make purchases there. But let's discuss this. And really from the jump, it looked like it was going to be a pretty boring game. But not boring as in lopsided as it turned out to be. Boring in the sense that it was going to be a defensive slugfest. It was going to be a wrestling match in the mud between these two teams. And then, well, what do you know? Indiana throws a pick after Notre Dame threw a pick, except Notre Dame is pinned inside of their own 5, whereas Indiana got the ball inside Notre Dame territory. So it was kind of a trading of offensive inefficiency is what this game started out as. But then Jeremiah Love hit his 98-yard run, where he was clearly faster than anyone on Indiana's defense. And once, Pat Coogan, Billy Scruth, Rocco Spindler, that interior of the O-line that held up their own, I think, against an elite defensive tackle unit, once they were able to create a hole there, he was gone. He was gone right on the outside. And that Notre Dame offensive line was very impressive in my mind. Knapp and Wagner as well at tackle. I was impressed by them, and I thought that overall Notre Dame's offense functioned at a much higher level than Indiana's did, and both of these defenses were pretty equal in my mind. But the offense, Mike Denbrock's offense, better than Tino Sunseri's offense, both in game plan, execution, talent. I mean, Faison, for example, he had a really good game, and you could clearly see his athleticism contrasted starkly to some of Indiana's defensive players. Until Indiana's last touchdown, this is an impact statistic right here. This tells you the result of the game if I explain this to you, what's going to happen before it kicks off. Until Indiana's last touchdown, the final touchdown play, the 23-yard pass to Omar Cooper Jr., Notre Dame had more rushing yards than Indiana had passing yards. That right there tells the whole story right there. Now, maybe there's a weird scenario where IU has a ton of rushing yards too, so then it doesn't matter. But Indiana's rushing offense did not enter this game known to be very strong, and while Notre Dame's rushing offense, or defense rather, is far from perfect, it's still a good, great rushing defense. So I tell you that, then you likely know the outcome of this game and likely know it's also going to be ugly in favor of the Irish. And it was. Notre Dame had that 98-yard rushing touchdown. And, of course, Indiana did pretty well against the run outside of that. But you can't give that up and then have your offense stay completely dead until you're down 27-3 late in the fourth quarter. Notre Dame had 193 rushing yards for 5.5 yards per carry. They had 2 rushing touchdowns. Riley Leonard was very elusive in the pocket, was able to dodge almost any type of pressure that Indiana tried to send his way, and he was accurate. I thought that Riley Leonard had maybe his best game of his career, or one of the best games of his career, especially with Notre Dame and probably with Duke as well. Let's talk about Indiana here and some of the ramifications from this loss, then we'll get to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Indiana, as I said earlier, their lack of alien players killed them. Notre Dame has Jeremiah Love and Xavier Watts. These are alien players that can compensate for weaknesses or totally negate them on their side of the ball. Riley Leonard's having an awful day. Maybe has a day where he even sucks as a quarterback. Doesn't matter. Jeremiah Love's speed, athleticism, power, and also Notre Dame's collective offensive line being one of the best in the nation can carry their offense to victory. If the passing defense is having some issues, like it did against USC, well, Xavier Watts can turn what could be an offensive touchdown for USC into a defensive touchdown for Notre Dame and completely flip the game script. Who does Indiana have who can do that? Maybe some days Michael Kamara, maybe some days CJ West, but even then I don't think they're quite the aliens that Jeremiah Love and Xavier Watts are. In fact, I wouldn't even go as far to say that those players are aliens. They're X-Factor players, but a step below, freakish, insane talent, which is why I refer to them as aliens. And they're on the defensive line. They're not in positions to get a pick six, or they're not in positions to score touchdowns on offense. So just the placement of where Indiana's best players are, their limited depth, and the fact that they don't have multiple game breakers. I don't know if they have really any game breakers. That killed them. It was blatantly obvious who the more talented team was on top of who was more prepared. That was blatant. It was obvious. I mean, you saw that within 2 quarters of the game, and by halftime you thought to yourself, at least I did, like, wow, Notre Dame, it's not just the talent, it's also the preparation, and not overall talent, but selective talent as well. Notre Dame was just the better team, straight up. And Indiana, they didn't have, they weren't the Boise State Chris Peterson team, for example, that personally I thought they might be. I was wrong on that front for picking Indiana to win. I thought that they were going to be kind of the exception to the rule, like some of those Boise State teams were under Chris Peterson, or that I think Washington was a bit last year, although Washington was far more talented and actually had alien players compared to this Indiana team. They had Rome Odunze. They had Michael Penix Jr. I don't know if I'd say Michael Penix Jr. was an alien, but Rome Odunze certainly was, and their offensive line was ridiculously good. And they had Jabbar Muhammad at corner, and they were, more talented overall. Large part of that was because of development, I would say, but it's an exception to the rule. Like I said, with rare exception, do not pick a team who is very low down the blue chip ratio. Just don't do it. I've said on this show before that I think talent in terms of recruiting is overvalued. I think it is still, but again, there is a place for it. And I think that in a game like this, it was appropriate to mention that. So I think that the lack of a Jeremiah Love, Xavier Watts for Indiana did not help their cause at all. It also didn't help that Curtis Rourke had an abysmal game where he was just off, even if he was well protected, and he was well protected for much of the game, especially early. He just wasn't accurate. He was just a little bit off, throwing the balls behind or over or too much in front of his receivers. That's why he threw his only interception of the day to Xavier Watts, which set up the 98-yard rush by Jeremiah Love for a touchdown. He barely overthrew his man, Keshawn Williams, on that play. And if he threw it properly, it either probably would have been an incomplete off of Williams' hands, or maybe it would have been an awesome diving catch. And Notre Dame still probably wins based off of how the rest of the game goes, but maybe it's closer and more competitive, and we're talking about it differently. Rourke was 20 of 33 for 215 yards, 6.5 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. And those 2 touchdowns, along with most of his passing yards, were in garbage time. He had an awful, again, it was an abysmal performance by Curtis Rourke. He had a 63.6 QBR. It was worse than that. That was because he had 2 touchdowns late in the game where Notre Dame obviously changed up their defensive scheme and had some backups in. Indiana's defense, though, this is the one positive from this game. I think they played very well. They had close to an elite game. Now, why do I say that? Because outside of the 98-yard rushing touchdown, Indiana allowed only 2.8 yards per carry outside of that. If you told me before the game that IU allowed, 198 rushing yards for 5.5 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns, but that one of those runs was a 98-yard score, I would have still thought to myself that IU likely would have won based off of how I viewed Indiana before this game. Because I said that Indiana was going to limit Notre Dame's rushing attack, not fully stop it, and I think that would have fit the bill. I think I was correct there, but what I wasn't correct on was the impact statistic that I told you all about, where in the game, for much of the game, Notre Dame had more rushing yards than Indiana did passing yards. You can't have that. Indiana's offense completely wasted an amazing defensive effort, where outside of really that one play and some of the long drives that Notre Dame had, where again, Leonard had just an amazing game, and on another day, maybe you don't see that. This defense had an elite game. They had 2 sacks. They had 10 TFLs against an offensive line that's up there for being the best in the country. And again, they only allowed 2.8 yards per carry, and that's CJ West, Tyreek Tucker, Michael Kamara, that's Aiden Fisher. That is that Indiana defensive front that is full of their best players on the team. So the defense, I don't think has anything to be ashamed of. I think that if the offense played a better game, maybe they would have held Notre Dame to 20 points or maybe a little bit lower than that, not 27. But the offense was completely shut down, completely, by Notre Dame. And we'll talk about Notre Dame's defense and Al Golden's unit and the great game he called. But I first want to talk about Mike Denbrock and how he worked Bryant Haynes, because I said that Indiana had an overall, I think, elite game on defense. But Notre Dame also had an elite game on offense. And at the end of the day, Notre Dame's schematics and execution on offense, I think, were just a little bit better than IU's on defense, which is very impressive. And I thought to myself, especially schematically, Notre Dame won the battle with their offense versus Indiana's defense, because when you allow 2 sacks and you're Notre Dame and 10 TFLs, and outside of that long run, you're not running for 3 yards per carry, and you're only really passing for 5 yards per carry or 5 yards per attempt outside of that one deep shot, you're not having a lot of successful plays analytically. But you're still extending drives, you're marching down the field, and you're getting touchdowns, and you're doing it against one of the better defenses in the country. Mike Denbrock put together a phenomenal game plan. They averaged 0.386 points per play, the Irish did, and they slowly constricted Indiana's defense until they just kind of fell flat, if we're being honest here. They had over 200 passing yards, close to 200 rushing yards. Notre Dame had 35 minutes and 40 seconds of possession, 20 first downs, 394 total yards, and most of those statistics were fulfilled before Indiana scored all of their 14 points in the fourth quarter. At one point, Notre Dame had like a 15-minute TOP edge. They were 7 of 13 on third down. They didn't really have to go for it on fourth down or think about it a whole lot. By the way, that one play call by Marcus Freeman, where it was on 4th and 8, and they ran this trick play that completely failed and almost gave IU, they probably wouldn't have done anything with it, but they gave them the ball back after a long drive with some momentum. What a gift by Cignetti to call the timeout before that play, because that was one of the dumbest decisions I have ever seen in a playoff game. Even more so than James Franklin going for it on 4th and 10 against SMU when you're up by 7 and SMU's like moving you around a little bit on defense, at least initially. Like, why not take the 3-score lead if you're Notre Dame? Why not take the 2-score lead if you're Penn State? I just don't get it. It's why I don't fully trust Marcus Freeman, but he was the better head coach in this game, and his coordinators were the better coordinators in this game. So there's that, and I think that Mike Denbrock especially showed why he is one of the best offensive coordinators, if not the best offensive coordinator in college football. The Irish, on defense, looked like college football's best. The final score of this game, in truth, was 27-3. Maybe 20-3, if you don't want to count anything in the fourth quarter because the game was already over. But allowing Indiana to score 3 points until garbage time is pretty impressive. And Indiana scored those 3 points on a sub-50-yard drive. They had good field position, and that played into them kicking that field goal. Indiana only ran for 2.3 yards per carry. They passed for 6.5, 6.3 yards per carry. Indiana only averaged 10.8 yards per reception. They did force 3 sacks and 10 tackles for loss, Notre Dame's defense did. And they also had an interception by Xavier Watts. It's just overall an awesome game by Notre Dame's defense. Indiana was 1 of 1 on fourth down, but 4 of 12 on third down, and it was even worse before the fourth quarter took over. And I was just, it was amazing watching how fast Notre Dame was on defense compared to IU on offense. And that's something that in hindsight I should have picked up, because Indiana has not had a fast offense all season long. It's very systemic. It relies on them being more fundamentally sound than you. And against Notre Dame, unless they don't bring their best game, that's not going to work, because they're very athletic. They recruit at a high level. They're developed, I think, at a high level, and they're deep, and they're old too. Watts could have went to the NFL last year. He came back, so he's a veteran. Jack Kaiser has been with the program at linebacker for like ever. I think he's a 6th year, might even be a 7th year, but he's a graduate, so I think he's for certain a 6th year. This defense was incredible Friday night, and when you get that pressure on IU, when you force 10 TFLs, when you're winning the line of scrimmage like that, and you force Curtis Rourke, one of the more efficient QBs in the country, to completely throw off kilter, and you limit an IU rushing attack that's good in power situations, and they weren't, that's impressive, and that's to be praised. And last but not least for Notre Dame, they have a good path for the Natty. I think that's a takeaway that we have to discuss that's should be obvious right now. They're actually favored, or they were favored over Georgia. I think that sharps bettors and public bettors are probably slamming Georgia against Notre Dame because it's Kirby Smart with a bye. Georgia, recruiting-wise, is more talented than Notre Dame, and as I've said before, recruiting matters, but people act like the number one recruiting class always wins the national championship. That's not how it works. It helps. It can help a lot, but that's not how it works here. But Notre Dame, the fact that they're not even a 3-point, not even a field goal underdog to Georgia, and that they opened up as a favorite, should tell you something here. They're viewed as an elite team relative to this year by Vegas. And if they beat Georgia, who says they can't beat Penn State or Boise State? And then who says they can't go and win it all? They're going to face Georgia, who's without Carson Beck, and then they're going to play, if they beat Georgia, the winner of Penn State versus Boise State. They have a good path to at least reach the national championship game. Now, I'm against the whole natty or bust narrative, so if you reach the national championship game, just play your best game, win or lose, at least you made the national championship game. And Marcus Freeman already has had the most postseason success of any Notre Dame head coach since Lou Holtz? Because Notre Dame hadn't won a postseason game, a New Year's Six Bowl game, since the 90s. They finally won a postseason game. So congratulations to you if you're a Notre Dame fan. If you're an Indiana fan, of course, this is a somber ending to a great season. But it's a great season. First 11-win season in school history. So go Hoosiers, go Fighting Irish, and I'm excited to see where Notre Dame goes on from here in the college football playoff. So that's that right there. Notre Dame again beating Indiana 27-17. Now it's time to talk about Penn State and how they emasculated SMU on national TV. Penn State destroys SMU, emasculates them. They tore them apart and then tore them into multiple different pieces yet again. They subdivided SMU. They beat them 38-10. And this game was close for a few minutes, but eventually SMU started making a lot of mistakes, and those mistakes began to snowball. Kevin Jennings and the whole team looked broken, and I was live covering this game. I'm live covering all the college football playoff games, doing play-by-play and analysis and commentary. So you should subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we do that. But both offenses were awkward initially. And then I wrote down that Kevin Jennings' accuracy is terrible, because it was. He had some open receivers where things could have been different, and there were moments where if he made some plays with his legs, like just pick up the 4th and short instead of being greedy, maybe the game could have been closer. But Penn State's D-line owned SMU's offensive line. Penn State, as the game went on, just finally began to round into form. The offense didn't have to do much, but still at the end of the game, they were dominating in the defense. It was never in doubt that Penn State had one of the nation's best defense. The game was over at half. It was 28-0, same as the halftime score between Penn State and Washington. So that should tell you something about Penn State when their defense is on like that, and also when their offense can at least wake up before halftime. So we're going to discuss this game in full. Again, as I mentioned earlier, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here or go live for games or our weekly live shows. Comment your reaction to this game down below. Join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And also, if you want to support the channel monetarily, check out the Patreon page or merchandise store. Links to those are in the description or in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Or you can send a YouTube super thanks via the comment section. Just if you want to. It's an extra. Your support of just subscribing and watching and engaging, I already appreciate very, very, very much. That's just an extra. But the Nittany Lions here are one of the best teams in college football. Seriously. And I've been saying this for weeks, and that doesn't mean they'll win it all. I wouldn't favor them to win it all right now. They still have some issues. I mean, James Franklin, what are you doing? You can go up by 10 points. Your kicker, Ryan Barker, has been accurate for much of the year, as long as it's not a 50-yarder. Just let him kick a long one, and maybe build some confidence if he makes it. And if he doesn't, oh well, at least you learn something new about your special teams unit. Because special teams, especially in close games, which Penn State will play in the college football playoff, most likely, they matter. Special teams does, especially in those games. So I didn't understand going for it on 4th and long there, especially when your downfield passing attack in that game was not clicking. And it's been that way all season long against good defenses, which SMU has. But aside from that, if I told you before the game that Penn State was +3 in turnovers and forced 2 pick-sixes, you probably pick Penn State to cover. You may bet a significant amount of money on that or be tempted to, even if you are not a bettor. Like I said in my notes, Kevin Jennings is terrible. And in the second quarter, things started to snowball. Drew Aller and the running backs began to hum. Aller began to become more accurate, really settle in. The running backs began to hit their holes. The O-line began to block well. It was pure domination, absolute domination. And I think SMU got broken by a variety of things, but most of all, I think that was just Penn State's advantages in so many different things. A lot of people thought that SMU, because of their trench play, could maybe make this close, and also because James Franklin doesn't have a very good resume against the best teams in the nation, and he doesn't. It's actually a terrible resume. The issue with that logic is SMU was never one of the best teams in the country. That's why I picked Penn State to win 34-17 and more than cover. In fact, my prediction was a little bit too conservative there because SMU didn't score a single point in the first half. Penn State had 2 pick-sixes and 2 offensive touchdowns, and the game was over at halftime. I look at this game, and I think that SMU is a classic example of the laws of college football. Now, what do I mean by that? What is Sam over here, just some guy in a studio? What does he mean by that? Well, let me tell you what that means. What that means is in the 12-team college football playoff format, you have to have 12 teams competing for it all. Now, by that criteria, by the fact that SMU's 2 losses were 3 points to a Clemson team that played the most competitive game in the first round with an elite Texas team, elite relative to this season. We've already talked about how I think this is a very down year. And also that their second loss was during a QB change early in the year at 3 at home to a good BYU team. They deserve to get in relative to that. They didn't lose by 21 points to Oklahoma, which is just disgusting. I mean, that on top of losing by 5 to Vanderbilt on the road and also losing to a Tennessee team that got smoked by OSU, hasn't really had an impressive win for all of the year outside of against Alabama, where they had a pretty poor performance, and I think Milroe was injured, so they weren't as good as they usually were. I think that's indicative of the fact that Alabama didn't deserve to get in the playoffs, but I think that opinion was valid even before these results in the first round. That doesn't change the fact that SMU was never going to win it all. The odds of that happening were infinitesimally small. A lot of luck had to go their way for them to even advance past this game, and things didn't go their way. I mean, Kevin Jennings had one of the worst games of his year. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that was against the best defense he had played all season long. Clemson's defense is mediocre. It might even be a bad defense for a Power 4 unit. It's one of the more ineffective, inefficient defenses in the Power Four because they're mediocre with all that blue chip talent on that side of the ball. I imagine, and we'll talk about this later in the live show, that Dabo Swinney might make coaching changes on that side of the ball. That's how underperforming that defense is. And they were confusing Jennings early and getting pressure on him. BYU's defense, it's good, but it's not great. It's not elite. That's Penn State's defense right there. And we saw what happened when SMU, or a team of SMU's caliber, goes up against a team like Penn State's caliber. Or you could say the same thing about Tennessee, who I think is closer to SMU, honestly, than they are to Penn State or OSU. Or Clemson, closer to Tennessee and SMU than they are to any of the hosting playoff teams. It's the same thing with Indiana, closer to Tennessee and SMU than Penn State, Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Texas. The home teams were considerably better than the away teams. Add on the fact that they had home field advantage, and most of the time there was a long distance traveled or a weather change. You get what happened against SMU, where Penn State just bombed them in every which way. It was a splattering in Beaver Stadium, in State College. SMU, I think the only positive from this game might be that they held up on the line of scrimmage for a quarter and a half. But they eventually fell apart because when your QB throws 2 pick sixes, you're down by double digits. You immediately have to tweak your game plan to get back in this because you know you're not just going to drive down the field every time you get the ball on this defense and score. So you have to change your approach here. And then Penn State, they QB sneak, which, again, I think that was a dumb decision. If Penn State is going to go for it on 4th inches from their own 20, this sounds weird, it sounds unconventional, but you line up in shotgun. You kind of do what Michigan does, where it's a shotgun pretty close to the line of scrimmage, what they did with Jim Harbaugh, and you just power run it up the middle. You give your running back some momentum. You don't do a QB sneak with Drew Aller, who is not a quarterback who likes to run the ball or is a big fan of power running. I don't get why you did that if you're Penn State. But anyway, you get the ball there, and your QB throws it right to Dominic DeLuca, who bats it in the air and picks it off. At that point, you have to be thinking to yourself that nothing is going your way. None of the balls are bouncing your way, and that, plus the cold weather, and more importantly, the fact that Penn State is bigger, faster, stronger, and came up with a better game plan than you did, at some point you just break. And while SMU forced 3 sacks, 5 tackles for loss, and they had 2.9 yards per carry, and that was non-sack adjusted, so I just took the sacks out of that. And they did some good things in the trenches, but overall, they still allowed 3 sacks, 11 TFLs from Penn State. They were holding Abdul Carter all the time. Didn't matter. He still got to the quarterback. And Penn State averaged 5.4 yards per carry, again, taking out the sacks that SMU had there to paint a better picture. Kevin Jennings, as I said previously, faced a top 5 defense and just crumbled. 20 of 36 on the day, 195 passing yards, 5.4 yards per attempt, a touchdown in garbage time, 3 interceptions. He had negative 25 ground yards, so his ground game wasn't much of a factor here. And he had a quarterback efficiency rating of 13.8. So accuracy, terrible. Decision-making, are you an FCS quarterback? I think Kevin Jennings is overall a good quarterback, and I think that the reason they didn't bench him in this game is Preston Stone is playing at Northwestern, so you're kind of wasting snaps if you're playing him. And to add on to that, Kevin Jennings is a sophomore. Like, he's going to be their starting QB next year unless, for whatever reason, someone gets him in the portal. He's their future QB. Excuse me there. So I think that they just wanted to continue to play him and get him experience, even if it was in garbage time. But he had a rough game, and he absolutely crumbled. There's no doubt about that. Let's talk about Penn State now. And I want to give props to Tom Allen for responding after that Oregon game, because that Oregon game was bad. Penn State could not cover Oregon's wide receivers. Consequently, they had to continue to adjust. They were out of position and uncomfortable. That allowed Oregon to run the football at times. They started off the game running the football strong. Penn State began to control it. Then toward the end of the game, they were able to reestablish it because no matter what happened in that game, in the Big Ten championship game, Oregon was able to pass the football, specifically to Tez Johnson, over the middle, side to side, wherever. Penn State couldn't stop Oregon at all. And that's part of the reason why I picked Penn State to win this game 34-17, and for SMU to score some points, particularly early. But that's not what happened here. Instead, Penn State allowed 3 points in the third quarter. They allowed 7 points in the fourth, shut out SMU in the first half. They had a strong showing early, which we have not seen from Tom Allen's defense all season long. They only allowed 10 points, 253 total yards, 21 first downs, 0.132 points per play, and 3.3 yards per play. They put on the most impressive defensive showing, the most impressive one outside of maybe Notre Dame of the first round. Texas had their issues. Ohio State, they allowed some points in the first half against a Tennessee offense that's just straight up broken. But still an elite performance from OSU. I'm not taking a shot or anything, or not taking anything away from that performance. It's just that what Notre Dame and Penn State did was just borderline insane, holding Indiana and SMU, efficient offenses, top 10 in scoring, collectively to 3 combined points. What a job by Tom Allen, and I want to shout out Deion Barnes especially, where his unit, the Penn State defensive line, was just eating up and swallowing up that SMU offensive line. They were stronger, bigger, faster. The epitome of this game was Abdul Carter lining up in 9 technique at left defensive end and just kind of dancing, and he's bobbing, he's excited, he's pumped up. And Bird, the left tackle, he's this big guy, he's sizable, he's not great, but he's not terrible. And every time Abdul Carter comes at him, this is Bird, and this is Abdul Carter. And Abdul Carter just goes around him with little to no contact. The only way there's contact between those two is if Bird's holding him. That's it. That was the epitome of this defensive performance by Penn State against SMU. They were just always on top of it. And always, not even 1 step ahead, but 2 or 3 steps ahead, really, of what SMU was doing. I want to ask this question because I mentioned it after the Oregon game, and I think that Ohio State's trench play overall was pretty great. Texas was great. Notre Dame's was very, very good, great. But Penn State in this game really owned SMU in the trenches in a way that I don't think a lot of people expected. I didn't even expect them to do this phenomenally against SMU. Now, some of that was the fact that I didn't think Kevin Jennings was going to throw 2 pick sixes, but nonetheless, I also thought that Penn State would score in the 30s more so because of their offense. So the offense was a little bit more off kilter than I expected. But do they have college football's best trench play? Because they were still able to run on a pretty good rushing defense, and they were able to do a pretty good job at containing Kevin Jennings and getting pressure on him just with their defensive line, some with their linebackers as well. But I thought in the trenches, when you have 189 rushing yards, this is not sack adjusted to paint this type of picture, 4.7 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns, you get 11 TFLs and 3 sacks, and you only allow 58 rushing yards and 1.6 yards per carry. And yes, you allow some sacks, but we've talked about this before. SMU's defensive line is a power 4 defensive line. It's not the best defensive line in the world, but it's power 4 caliber. There are some aspects of SMU that are definitely group of 5 caliber. Their defensive line is not one of those aspects. Same with their linebacker core. So, do they? I want you to answer that in the comments section. Do you think that there's a world where Penn State has the nation's best trench play? I said that after the Big Ten championship game. I'd probably still lean yes there, but I have to think about it more because there were so many teams who just owned their opponent in the trenches. Really, all the home teams had the trench advantage on top of home field advantage, on top of overall being the better team. So we have more sample sizes for a lot of these teams in the playoffs, and yet these games at home kind of looked similar for the home teams in a lot of regards. Of course, that's a very broad picture. there were some clear differences, like Ohio State beating Tennessee over the top, which opened up the ground game. Penn State was just pummeling SMU and playing a pretty vanilla, bland, boring game after the pick sixes. Notre Dame was very systemic. They didn't have really any explosive plays outside of that 98-yard run, but they held Indiana to 3 points and made a very boring, muddy wrestling match. And then Texas-Clemson, Texas, they got pressure on Cade Klubnik. They stopped Clemson from running the ball, and they ran for nearly 300 yards on, granted, a very bad rushing defense by the Tigers. But we'll get to that. I just wanted to mention those other teams and games to compare to Penn State's trench play, because I was very impressed with what Penn State did in the trenches. I thought SMU might hold up just a tad bit better, a little bit, but nope. Penn State, once again, their D-line one of the nation's best and their O-line one of the nation's best. They come through even when, Drew Aller doesn't have a really good game. Same with his receivers. And where Tyler Warren, always a great player, but he was not used that much, in part, I think, because of some of Aller's struggles. Last but certainly not least, I'm not going to take anything away from Penn State here. This is not taking away anything from them. But Penn State hosting playoff games is going to be a problem for anyone who has to travel there in December. The stadium was loud, and the weather with 20-mile-per-hour something winds and the cold, if you're a team from the South and you're traveling to, this slightly higher altitude of Beaver Stadium where it can be windy because, you're in between mountains, but Happy Valley, it's called Happy Valley because it's kind of in a valley, it can get higher winds, gusts, it's cold, and that crowd in the stadium is one of the loudest environments in football. That's a problem for teams. And SMU, you could tell they were not prepared, they were demoralized, and eventually they didn't quit, but they were definitely disinterested well before the game was over. That's not to take anything away from Penn State. Penn State's play contributed a lot to that, but it's sort of like the icing on the cake, the stadium and the weather, that all added on to what was a perfect performance by Penn State's defense. Still, I think, a good overall performance by the offense, and just what a win for Penn State and James Franklin to get to 12 wins. James Franklin's first ever 12-win season, and now he has 100 career wins with the Penn State Nittany Lions. So go Mustangs and go Nittany Lions. And I'm excited to talk about Penn State's Fiesta Bowl matchup against Boise State. So we're now going to talk about, bless me. We're now going to talk about Texas-Clemson here, but first and foremost, I want to read the chat and get a pulse on some things. Wow, we have over 100 concurrent viewers. This is awesome, guys. Keep this up. Let me see what you guys are reading, and then we'll talk about some more of these games. Let me see. Let me see. Looks like a lot of people are Penn State should drag Boise, says someone. Penn State Jim, talking about how Boise State fans apparently think Penn State doesn't have much of a shot. That's interesting. There's a lot of talk about Ohio State, Oregon in the chat, and we're going to get to that in this live stream. We're going to get to that at the end of the end of the video. We're going to talk about that because I think that is going to be a storyline that is awesome to follow. I do think that may be looked upon when this is all said and done as potentially the de facto national championship game. That wouldn't shock me one bit. So someone else says everyone in the playoffs is, quote, on a mission. I felt that way with all the home teams. I felt that way with Clemson. I felt that way with, I didn't feel that way with Tennessee, Indiana, or SMU. I felt that Clemson was on a bit of a mission, but then again, maybe it's just the fact that Texas has some weaknesses that Clemson exposed. And Clemson is more talented than those other four teams, but in terms of average performance, they also have not played as good as Tennessee, SMU, and Indiana have. They straight up have not performed at the same level of those three. There's a strong argument, I think, that outside of maybe Boise State and maybe Arizona State, that Clemson was the worst team of the playoffs. I mean, Louisville decked them. Georgia humiliated them. South Carolina, that was a good game by Clemson, but they lost. And then Texas, I feel like if Texas didn't take their foot off the gas, they could have won this thing in blowout fashion. I felt like they took their foot off the gas, and the defense just fell apart after that happened. But let's talk about this here. Let's talk about Texas versus Clemson. I believe that Texas versus Clemson was the most entertaining college football playoff first round game of the first ever 12-team playoff. I believe that because in the fourth quarter, I know that a lot of people, and I know this because my live concurrent viewers on my play-by-play stream of this game was increasing in the fourth quarter. I know that many people were sitting on their seats thinking, after Clemson made it 31-24 with that, 4th and goal conversion, that touchdown pass by Klubnik, oh man, what happens if Steve Sarkisian chokes this game away? Because the momentum was in Clemson's favor, and Texas's defense looked very discombobulated. They looked, honestly, like they checked out of the game after it was a 21-point matchup. And it looked a little bit similar for the offense, too. They were a little bit clunky to come out of halftime. I think, though, in hindsight, maybe it wasn't that Texas checked out. It's rather the fact that this Texas team, and Texas fans know this from the Georgia games or other matchups, they're incapable of looking like an elite team for, I would say, even 3 quarters. There's always going to be 1 quarter or even 1 whole half, just maybe not in a part, like maybe the second quarter and the fourth quarter, or the second quarter and third quarter, where this team kind of lulls into mediocrity by Texas standards. But they win. They win 38-24. And my biggest takeaway from this game is when you have 300 rushing yards, you're probably not going to lose, especially when the other team's starting running back and second string running back are out for much of the game or for the vast majority of the game. Texas took over in the second quarter. Their offensive line and running backs did. The rushing offense, by the way, not very productive, but in this game it was. So we're going to talk about that. Before we do, though, I encourage you, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and also hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live, where I do play-by-play and color commentary and interact with the chat during the playoff games, and also when we do our weekly live show, or you can get notified when I release videos, whether they're live show cuts or deep dives previewing certain games, or maybe interviews that I do with other channels. We're trying to become the best college football channel on YouTube, and only you can help us do that. Also, join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can check out my merchandise store or Patreon page. Links are in the description or down below in the top of the comment section in the pinned comment. And also comment your reaction to this game down below. So let's get in here into what I think, again, was the most entertaining first round game this Saturday. And really overall, obviously more entertaining than the Friday night game between Notre Dame and Indiana. That was boring. That was honestly like a Big Ten West game. That was sort of like a really good Iowa team in Notre Dame beating up on a very poverty Purdue team. This game right here was fireworks. And I think you can very much gather that from the final score being 38-24. That right there being 62 combined points. So the impact stat here is something I mentioned just a few seconds ago, that Texas forced 292 rushing yards down Clemson's throat, and they had 4 rushing touchdowns, and they averaged 6.1 yards per carry. You tell me those numbers before the game, and there's no way that Clemson wins. None. And honestly, after some of those long runs that Texas produced early on, Clemson was doing an okay job at least slowing the rushing game down, stopping the bleeding. And then, after that 10-play, 64-yard, 4-minute, 12-second drive by Clemson where TJ Moore had that 7-yard touchdown reception, Jaden Blue took off for a 77-yard touchdown run. And at that point, you kind of sensed this game's probably over. That's probably right there the final nail in the coffin, because now Clemson has to create 2 more sustainable touchdown drives. They haven't been able to really do that all day. So Yeah, like game over right there. That was it. So that's the impact statistic right there. And I want to talk about Clemson first. We saved the best for last on this channel, then we'll get to Texas here. First and foremost, Clemson's rushing defense is bad. It lost them this game. It's not just meh. It's not just, oh well, kind of a weakness, but we can deal with it. It's bad. It is horrific. Texas had, I think, their best rushing offense, their best production on the ground for the entire season against Clemson's defense. This is why I say before that recruiting matters, talent matters. Case in point, I think, is Cade Klubnik and those wide receivers. But also it can be very overvalued if it's not developed properly. That is Clemson's defense. Clemson's defense has a lot of blue chip talent, but my goodness, they don't play like it at all. They allowed almost 300 rushing yards, and they were consistently owned up front, not just by Texas's starting offensive line, but by the backups they had to rotate in after Jake Majors and Cameron Williams tragically went down with injuries. And I hope and pray that they're healthy, and they come back quickly. Same with Quintravion Wisner. So Texas got a lot of injuries in the trenches and in their rushing offense as this game progressed, and they still dominated. We're talking about a Clemson defense that has Barrett Carter, that has TJ Parker, that has Peter Woods. They can't stop the run to save their life. Imagine some of the Georgia teams of the past, or the Michigan or Ohio State teams of the past, or maybe this year's Penn State or past Oregon teams, or some of the Nick Saban Alabama teams. They would run for 400 yards on this defense because Texas plainly can't run the football. But they were able to against Clemson because Clemson on the season entering this game gave up 4.5 yards per carry. This rushing defense is awful. And I think that a performance like this, especially given how they were able to do what every defense, for the most part, has been able to do to Quinn Ewers, confuse him make some stupid mistakes, this is a performance that might get someone fired on defense, in my opinion. Again, allowing almost 300 rushing yards. They were consistently owned up front, and it just wasn't good. Clemson's rushing defense lost them this game because Cade Klubnik in the offense impressed me. I know that they impressed a lot of people. And if you told me that Clemson entering this game was going to score 24 points, that they were going to have 336 passing yards, 3 touchdowns a pick, 7.8 yards per attempt, I don't know if I would have picked Clemson to win, but I would have been very tempted to, and I certainly would have picked them to cover. That's not what happened here because they gave up 38 points. So the defense totally ruined what was one of Clemson's best offensive games in recent memory in the 2020s for head coach Dabo Swinney. And also, I think one of the better games by offensive coordinator for Clemson now for 2 years, Garrett Riley, who I imagine will be going in on his 3rd year for Clemson this coming season with the improvements this offense had compared to last. Clemson also had 76 rushing yards for 3.2 yards per carry. They were able to keep Texas a little bit honest on the ground at times, and the Tigers scored 0.348 points per play, and they averaged 6 yards per play. Again, all of that negated by just a bad rushing defense. So really, shame on Mickey Kahn and Wes Goodwin for ruining what was an impressive game for Garrett Riley and also for Cade Klubnik. I mean, Cade Klubnik is, after a game like this, we'll see what the rest of the college football playoff looks like, but I have a Texas friend of mine who's very analytical, very good with numbers, with betting, power ratings, with game predictions. And he was telling me that he thinks that Cade Klubnik might be the best QB that Texas plays in the playoff, certainly in terms of NFL talent. I don't know if he meant that in the way of collegiate success, but in the sense of raw talent, he certainly thinks that, maybe overall as well. And I know that Clemson relies on Cade Klubnik to have success more than almost any other offense in the playoff relies on their QB to have success. So I'm curious to see if Clemson exposed some things in Texas's secondary. I know that Texas's DBs are probably overvalued and not the best secondary in the country, but I still think they're good, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. Before we talk about the Longhorns, the winning team, and the fact that Steve Sarkisian now has back-to-back 12-win seasons, good for him. As I said last year, even with Texas not winning at all, I think just winning the Big 12 was enough to say that Texas was back. With the way they did, how they were building their program, getting better and better every season, I thought that was good enough to say that Texas is back, even though they didn't win it all. They didn't even play for the national title. But they could have beaten Washington. They won the Big 12. I thought that was good enough to say that they were back. We'll talk about them. But Clemson has a lot of players returning next season. Klubnik should be back. And they have some players in the offensive line, defensive line, and defense who should be back. You know, Bryant Wesco Jr. is a very young receiver. And I believe it's TJ Moore as well, who's another young receiver for them, who's a freshman. Yes, he is. And TJ Moore this year has had 651 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. And Bryant Wesco has had a pretty good year as well, 708 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. They have some young receivers who had a ton of success this year. And I think that, look, they could be pretty good next year. And they're using the portal. They're bringing in Will Helt from Purdue, who I think is a good D-end, who will fit them well. They're bringing in a FCS wide receiver to add some depth to that room. I imagine they could bring in some more portal players. And maybe what forced the issue is the fact that Clemson's bringing in a pretty terrible recruiting class by their standards. It's low in volume and low in average player rating. So this recruiting class, by the way, majority of them are 3 stars, and they got their QB from Coastal Carolina. So I think now they need to use the portal, like officially need to use it to even just have like a season where they finish inside the top 25. That's how dire it is on the recruiting front. And I don't know exactly why that is. Maybe they went big and they busted. More likely than not, I don't think their NIL is in a situation to be paying for a lot of high schoolers. But also it might be the fact that Clemson's clearly been waning as a program. This season was better than last year. This Clemson team was better than last year's. But was it so much better to re-inspire your faith in the program as a whole? For me personally, no, but that could change next year. I think they could make a college football playoff run next year with what they should bring back, with the eligibility their players have, the fact that they have stacked enough talent and they've hired enough good coaches, I think, like Matt Luke for O-line coach, Garrett Riley as the OC, to where I think they can have some success and be better next year than they were this year. Let me know what you think about that in the comments section below, by the way. But let's talk about Texas. The offense was impressive, but I think it still has questions. And I say that because Clemson's defense is massively overrated. You know, people have talked about, I heard people say this year, oh, Clemson is a really good defense. No, they don't. Look at the numbers. Watch the film. Every competent offense they've played has worked them. Pitt's backup quarterback scored 20 points on them. Pitt stinks. South Carolina has limitations. I think that's probably the only reason South Carolina didn't hang 30 points on them, is South Carolina has issues. They're not a complete team. South Carolina, a lot of it is Lenora Sellers being amazing, Raheem Sanders being amazing, and their defense just owning people up front. They still have issues on the lines of scrimmage on the offensive line, and their receivers are not perfect. Georgia smoked them, hung 34 points on them, and Georgia's offense is dysfunctional. Texas, in terms of ceiling, was probably the best offense they've played all season long, in terms of ceiling. And Texas could have scored 50 on them if they didn't check out, in my opinion. So kudos to the offense. When you average 0.507 points per play and 6.6 yards per play, that's good. In fact, those numbers are great/elite, but you have to take them with context. This is not Tennessee's defense. This is not even a caliber of defense that SMU has. This is not Indiana's defense. This was the worst defense that Clemson had by a significant mile in the first round. So I just want people to take what Texas did on offense with a grain of salt. Maybe they have figured things out on the ground, but again, Clemson is a bad rushing offense. And with Quinn Ewers, it was another game where Quinn Ewers showed you some of his ceiling, but also showed you some of his floor and some of the inaccuracies that he has. For Texas, they have to play Arizona State in the Peach Bowl. Now, that's a pretty favorable draw. They should beat Arizona State. But I'm curious to see how Sam Leavitt does against their secondary, because Leavitt has some good wide receivers. He has an okay offensive line, and he has Cam Scadaboo, who can be a receiving back and also just a straight-up power back. And it's Kenny Dillingham, who I think's done a really good job this year preparing his team for games. He has an extra week. I'm curious to see how this offense looks against Arizona State. I don't think it will look bad at all, because Arizona State's defense is, of course, one of the worst defenses in the playoff. But this is just something to keep in mind, that Texas's offense has been broken all season long. They scored 38 points in this game, but still were inconsistent for multiple drives. And they're missing two of their best offensive linemen currently. I don't know what the timetable is for Jake Majors and Cameron Williams to return. Based off of what I saw, I'm not a doctor, but based off of what I saw, I think Jake Majors will be back pretty soon. I think Cameron Williams is probably done for the rest of the year. That's just off of what I saw. I'm not a doctor. It's just my assessment. Could very well be wrong right there. The secondary for Texas, I still think, is a near elite unit relative to this season. It might even be elite relative to this year. But who knows? Because they allowed 336 passing yards. Malik Muhammad was being targeted over and over again, and he got cooked. Some of the other defensive backs got cooked on multiple passing plays. It wasn't like Texas's defense, we've talked about it before and others have, where Texas has elite speed on defense, or at least that's what I've thought. They did not look like they had elite speed defensively against Clemson's offense. Now, on the flip side, Texas's offense was way faster than Clemson's defense. That was clear. But Clemson's offense was able to, at times, out-scheme, but other times out-athlete Texas. With Cade Klubnik, his receivers, his offensive line, even at times tight end and running back room against Texas's defensive line, linebacker room, and secondary. And Cade Klubnik had an 81.5 QBR. Cade Klubnik had one of his more efficient games on the season, where in this matchup against Texas, again, over 300 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 43 attempts. His average QBR in the season's been a 79.1. He had an 81.5 QBR, which was only behind his performances against the Citadel, an FCS team, Wake Forest, who didn't go to a bowl game, North Carolina State, who early in the year was kind of like an FCS team, and App State, who, honestly, low-level G5 school, fired their head coach. It was a really good performance by Cade Klubnik. I think you could tell that there was a good game plan in place, but also, with unscripted drives toward the end, he just made some really good throws and was able to target some weaknesses in a Texas secondary that I still think is really good, but they haven't faced good QBs all year. You think about who Texas has played this season. They've played Colorado State, Michigan, UTSA, UL Monroe, Mississippi State, Oklahoma, Carson Beck, first time around when he was still throwing picks to whoever he played, Diego Pavia. They didn't play Florida when they had DJ Lagway. Arkansas, Kentucky, Texas A&M. The best QB they played in the regular season was probably Diego Pavia, who does not have the supporting cast that Clemson and Cade Klubnik do. And Cade Klubnik has more talent than Diego Pavia does. So do many of the quarterbacks in the college football playoff, at least similar or equal talent or better supporting cast to go along with a similar player in overall caliber to Pavia. I'm thinking of Dylan Gabriel, Will Howard, Drew Aller. Sam Leavitt's been pretty good this year at Arizona State. So it's something to keep in mind. I do think that the test that Clemson presented will be different than what other teams have presented due to the nature of their offense that Garrett Riley runs and the fact that they do have some talented receivers. Their O-line's one of their better O-lines in recent memory, and Klubnik is a good QB, but Oregon is a better passing attack. Ohio State has a better passing attack. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're a Texas fan. And then last but certainly not least, I hope the offensive line heals up quickly, because with how they did against Clemson on the ground, I know that I said it's probably not anything to take into consideration because of how bad Clemson's run defense is. But maybe they figured it out. And even if they haven't, I think Texas needs those players. Jake Majors at center, right tackle Cameron Williams, and also Quintravion Wisner, who's been their best running back. They need them to make a deep run, in my mind. They do. Against Arizona State, they should win, and I'll make a prediction video for that. Same with all the other quarterfinals in the next few days. And then especially against the winner of Oregon, Ohio State, and then whoever they play in the national championship, whether that's going to be Boise State or more likely Penn State, Notre Dame, or Georgia. They're going to need those players. So I'm going to be praying for Jake Majors and Cameron Williams. I think you should be too. We should all be hoping that they do get healthy. So thank you all for watching, and go Longhorns, go Tigers. And Texas, next up for them is the Peach Bowl against Arizona State. Okay. Alrighty, so next up is Tennessee, Ohio State, and then we'll get to some just shorter topics here, and that'll be good. We're already live for an hour, and we'll be live for probably just like, maybe 40 more minutes, then we'll get off. So let's see what we can do here. Well, we're getting 100 concurrent viewers on average. This is incredible. This is probably one of the best live shows that we've had in terms of non-play-by-play live shows. So thank you for that. Let's try and get to 50 likes before this stream is over. That would be incredible. 50 likes. Maybe even we can push it to 60. But let's talk about Ohio State annihilating Tennessee. The Ohio State Buckeyes destroy the Tennessee Volunteers in a game that was never close. 45-17 is the final score from Columbus, in a game where there were a lot of Tennessee fans in the stands, but it didn't matter because Jeremiah Smith is insane. Ryan Day put together an aggressive game plan, and Tennessee, all of their advantages that everyone was talking about, or that not everyone, but a lot of people were talking about for the week, they were overrated or even non-existent. Think of Tennessee's trench advantage. Did we see that show up? No, it was almost a non-factor. What about the explosive wide receivers of Tennessee? Nowhere to be found. What about Nico Imaliava? Oh, he's talented. Oh, he's a 5-star. He averaged less than 4 yards per pass attempt, and Ohio State was probably letting him run the football in exchange for not giving up big passing plays. It was one of the worst opening game plans, some of the worst scripted drives on both sides of the ball, offense and defense, that I have seen from Tennessee, or that I have seen in college football, rather. Just overly unimpressive on the Tennessee side, and for Ohio State, very impressive. They worked Tennessee in the trenches, on the perimeter, and in coaching, and game plan, and preparation, in energy. Ohio State is a different caliber of team, several tiers above a team like Tennessee. My biggest takeaway from here, from this matchup, was that Ohio State was aggressive, Tennessee was conservative, and also that Jeremiah Smith is insane. Before we continue with our analysis here, I encourage you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and comment your reaction to this game down below. Also, join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, and if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can check out my merchandise store or Patreon page and make purchases there. The links to those are in the description or in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. But the Buckeyes they wrecked Tennessee here. And as I pull up my notepad, Tennessee's pass protection was suspect entering this game. We knew that. I wrote that down because it was suspect during the game, and I underlined it because Ohio State was getting pressure with 4. Ohio State can't get pressure with 4. That's why their defensive line only accounts for, at least before this game, less than 60% of their sacks. They have to blitz to get pressure. Not against Tennessee, though, because Tennessee might have the worst tackles Ohio State has faced since the G5 teams they played in the non-conference. Ohio State owned the air while also balancing out Tennessee or even slightly beating them on the ground, and all of that was just a pure recipe for disaster on the Tennessee side. If I tell you entering this game, and this is a statistic from Darren Talks Ball, just look up his name on YouTube, you'll find the channel. It's the profile picture is a big microphone with, I think, DTB in red as the logo. Could be wrong on that, but you'll find it. It's a few thousand subs. He does good work, and he mentioned on Twitter, on X, that Ohio State had more points per drive, 3.8 points per drive, than Tennessee had yards per pass attempt through the air, 3.4. You tell me that, you tell someone who doesn't even know that much about college football outside of the basics, we both would agree that Ohio State would blow out Tennessee if you told us that in the pregame, unless Tennessee ran for 300 yards, but that was never, ever going to happen because, as we talked about on College Football with Sam in our previews, Tennessee is good at running the football because they run the ball a lot. They don't have the explosive rushing offense that Penn State does or that Ohio State had when Henderson gets in open space, because they still have that, or especially when they were able to have that more consistently before Seth McLaughlin and before Josh Simmons went down. And also they don't have what, Oregon does or what Notre Dame has again with Jeremiah Love. They don't have an explosive rushing attack. They don't. And Dylan Sampson was injured pretty early. Many of Tennessee's wide receivers were injured early. And Ohio State was aggressive. They were going over the top. They were working Tennessee schematically, and they put Tennessee behind the 8 ball so quickly that Tennessee didn't know what hit them. And at that point, in the end of the first quarter, the game was basically over. Tennessee tried to mount a comeback. They did outscore Ohio State 10-0 in the second quarter, shut them out. But there is a world where it's 28-3 entering the half. And in hindsight, it certainly felt like that entering halftime. And then Ohio State shut out Tennessee in the third quarter. It was 14-0. And eventually at one point they were up 45-10. It was beyond dominance. That game in the first quarter looked like Ohio State versus Michigan State in 2021. That's what that first quarter looked like, where these two teams did not deserve to be on the same field as each other. A lot of people were talking about, especially Lane Kiffin, that, I don't know, SMU didn't deserve to get in, or Indiana didn't deserve to get in. Well, by your same logic, Tennessee didn't either, because Tennessee's best win is over a 3-loss Alabama team that outside of that Georgia game was pretty mediocre by their own standards, a fairly ineffective, inefficient team. And Tennessee lost to Arkansas, who's 6-6, and they lost to a Georgia team who's had issues and is far from perfect by 14 points on the road. Here, 45-17. They just get absolutely splattered. And the only takeaway I have from such a matchup right there, or 42-17, not 45-17. My apologies there, 42-17. So my only takeaway for this was the fact that I thought Ohio State worked Tennessee coaching-wise. Tim Banks and Josh Heupel got worked. Tennessee allowed 0.656 points per play and 7.4 yards per play. They only gained 0.23 points per play and 3.5 yards per play. Tennessee did. That is a massive, massive disparity right there. That's an insane disparity. And you tell me that before the game. You tell anyone that, well, we all know that Ohio State is going to win and that they are going to win big. So that's the Tennessee side of things, is that your coaching staff was worked. and they couldn't do much about it. By the time that they adapted, the game was already over. And when you look at how Tennessee performed just on the field, not even coaching, their trench advantage that everyone was talking about, and even, I didn't say Tennessee had a massive trench edge. I said that it was a push, but if you had to force me to, I'd lean Tennessee. And even though I was a lot more on the side of Ohio State than a lot of people were in this matchup, I thought it was pretty obvious that Ohio State was going to win and potentially win big. I wasn't high on Ohio State enough in this game. We talked about this, but Tennessee's trench advantage was somehow even more overrated than I mentioned. Where I said Tennessee is James Pierce Jr., but they don't have much else that is going to wreak or wreak havoc on Ohio State, even with their banged-up O-line. They don't have many other players outside of him. They don't have a Michigan caliber D-line. They don't have a Penn State caliber D-line. I would say Oregon's D-line is better than Tennessee's in terms of X-factor talent and even depth. Tennessee doesn't have that. They have one elite player in James Pierce Jr., and in part because Tennessee sent 3 or 4 men forward and didn't send a lot of pressure, well, that gave Ohio State's offensive line time to work, time to block, time to have a really good game, if I'm being honest, relative to what I expected them to have. Tennessee did not have a trench advantage. They allowed 4 sacks. They didn't get any sacks. And Ohio State had the better rushing offense, even when their run blocking still looked a little bit clunky. They still ran the football better. So that's very discouraging if you're a Tennessee fan. Very discouraging. And in fact, I would even say disheartening. A lot of Tennessee fans showed up in Ohio Stadium expecting it to be a competitive game, and instead they got their butts kicked by Ryan Day and the Buckeyes. The Volunteers did their toughest team all season long, and they folded. They folded up like a lawn chair. The game was over in the first quarter. They had 2 weeks to prepare for a team of Georgia's caliber, because Ohio State and Georgia are in that elite tier. Ohio State may actually be better than Georgia, and within 15 minutes the game was over. It was lost. Now, when Tennessee scored that 10 points, I thought to myself, maybe they can crawl their way back in, but they never did. They never crawled their way out of the hole. So they never reversed the trend of the game being over, and Ohio State kept their foot on the gas. There was that weird screenplay they called where it was a 3rd and 1. They had a screen to Ibuka, and then James Pierce Jr. made a wonderful play to get over there and get a TFL. That play call wasn't ideal, but I also understand the logic behind it, because Ohio State's offensive line and run blocking just isn't that good. It's not. And especially in power situations, we've seen this offensive line fold up and give up interior and exterior leverage. So I understand the reasoning why they called that play. Ohio State's offense is not going to be an offense that is always going to be elite. Maybe relative to this year it is, but it's not always going to be the high-flying offense that it was in the first quarter for all 4 quarters if they face a good team, because of the limitations they have on that offensive line. But they coached a wonderful game. They had an elite game. Ohio State did. It's the 11th win of this season for the Buckeyes. Once again, Ryan Day never wins less than 11 games. Pretty incredible stuff. Tennessee finishes the year 10-3, and this was a sour end to the season. For Ohio State, I think it's pretty clear that Ryan Day has a Michigan problem, but not a top 10 problem. They had 317 passing yards, averaged 10.7 yards per attempt. At the end of the first quarter, they were averaging 20 yards per pass attempt. And the Buckeyes also had 156 rushing yards for 4.7 yards per carry, 6 total touchdowns. They had 0.656 gained points per play, and they averaged 7.4 yards per play. It was incredible. It was incredible stuff. Ohio State owned through the air, and I think the most impressive player of the game, honestly, was Travion Henderson. It was either Travion Henderson, Jeremiah Smith, Will Howard, or Jack Sawyer. It was one of those 4. Those were the 4 best players on the field for the Buckeyes. Henderson had 10 carries for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he made a lot of guys miss, put on some juke moves that are NFL caliber. He was used as a receiver, which I thought was genius by the staff. 4 receptions for 54 yards, long of 21. He's their best running back. I mean, this is another game where Judkins averaged fewer than 4 yards per carry. 10 carries, 34 yards, 3.4 yards per carry. And that isn't to say that Judkins is a bad running back. He's one of the better running backs in the Big Ten. But Henderson could be the best running back in the nation. He has that talent. Against Tennessee, Michigan, Indiana, Purdue, Nebraska, and Oregon, in 6 games out of the 7 Ohio State has played in, Judkins has averaged less than 4 yards per carry. He's their power back. With the current offensive line, and all 6 of those games were starting with the Oregon game and since then. So you take out the first 5 games, and in 6 of the last 7 games, outside of, well, wait. Hold on a minute. Tennessee, Michigan, Indiana, Purdue, Nebraska, Oregon. In 6 out of the last 8 games, Judkins has averaged fewer than 4 yards per carry. And Henderson, meanwhile, has had the success he did against Tennessee. Judkins still had 2 rushing touchdowns, and he also had some yards through the air, 9 receiving yards. Howard, 24 of 29 for 311, 10.7 yards per pass attempt, 2 touchdowns and a pick. He had a 98.8 quarterback efficiency rating. His best game, I think, of the season, up there with the Oregon game. Ohio State's receivers averaged 12.7 yards per reception. Jeremiah Smith had 6 receptions for 103 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Both of his touchdowns were on deep balls, were on balls of 20 yards or more. And he has now 12 receiving touchdowns and 1,037 receiving yards on the year. He's different. He may only be 19 years old, but he's a man. He's an alien. And he was torching Jermond McCoy, who was Tennessee's best corner. So, as I've said before, you cannot cover him. And it was a great job by Ryan Day to scheme up this game. And I think that Chip Kelly, obviously the offensive coordinator, the play caller, but this game had Ryan Day's fingerprints all over it. They went pass heavy and aggressive from the get-go. It had Ryan Day's fingerprints, particularly the 2021-2022 Ryan Day offensive fingerprints all over it. Now I want to talk about the trenches very briefly, because I still think Ohio State has issues there. This game does not convince me that their defensive line or offensive line is back. It's not. Because Tennessee's trench advantage has been massively overrated by everyone. Mainly because of James Pierce Jr. being an amazing player, and when you see that, one team has an alien at a certain position, you think that entire position's good. And in part it is because of that one player, but depth matters in these games. And you think because Dylan Sampson is the SEC Offensive Player of the Year that Tennessee's O-line must be good. In reality, a lot of that has to do more with Dylan Sampson individually, and also some of the weaker opponents that Tennessee has played, more so than the fact that Tennessee's trench play is that good. They were an overrated team entering this game. They were overrated in the trenches, and that can be true along with the fact that Ohio State's offensive line did just enough to put together a good performance, and also that Ohio State's defensive line played one of its better games of the year. The D-line got pressure, and they were doing it with 4. Jack Sawyer had 2 sacks on the not the season, but in this game in the postseason. He did a pretty good job, and JT Tuimoloau was also getting pressure. And I thought that the offensive line for Ohio State, the tackles, did a good job protecting for the most part. Howard, when there was pressure, often eluded it pretty well. And the interior of the O-line held up just enough to give Henderson a little bit of space, and he worked magic with that. And the speed difference between these two teams, let me tell you something. The speed difference was very apparent. Tennessee is a slow team. They're a slow, physical team. Bit lethargic, actually, because they're not as physical as people make them out to be. Ohio State is fast. And they're not just fast, too. They're physical, and they're physical everywhere but the O-line. This is not a unphysical team. Ohio State's problem isn't physicality. Their problem is schematics, and the fact of what they want to do is in direct conflict with what is in their best interest to do. What's in their best interest to do is run an air raid, basically. That is what's in their best interest. and use Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, and occasionally Howard's legs to keep people honest on the ground, and then play the defense they're playing. What they want to do is they want to be kind of a power spread option. They don't have the offensive line to do that. But what's encouraging if you're an Ohio State fan is that in this game, they didn't try to run a spread option with no offensive line. They just straight up said, okay, we're going to attack you downfield. We're going to be schematic. We're going to use motion. We're going to use eye candy. We're going to do what we have to do to confuse your defense and get the ball downfield. And we're going to trust Will Howard and trust our receivers to get the job done. And that's what is in Ohio State's best interest overall. And the trenches helped with that. The O-line protected Howard. They gave up no sacks. They allowed 7 TFLs, which again relates back to my point that this O-line is still not good. It is probably one of the worst offensive lines in the playoff. Might even be the worst offensive line in the playoff. But they did just enough to where the offense could hum and score 42 points. And Ohio State ran for 156 yards, averaged 4.7 yards per carry. And the defensive line for Ohio State had 6 DFLs and 4 sacks. I mean, they had a really good game. Tennessee never really had a rushing offense to start the game off until Nico started to run the ball. And he took a lot of hits, and he's definitely going to need an ice bath for this game. Last but certainly not least, this team can win it all. Bless me. They can win it all. Their wide receivers, running backs, linebackers, and defensive backs negate the weaknesses on the offensive line. And that's why they not just can win it all, but why they should be one of the favorites to win it all. Because no one has Jeremiah Smith, outside of maybe Oregon's Tez Johnson. And even then, I think Jeremiah Smith is a higher ceiling. Cody Simon and Sonny Styles are special. And it's even more so the case with Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs and Jordan Hancock, the safeties and nickelbacks. And Travion Henderson is a special player. The only running backs in the college football playoff that are comparable to him in terms of how special they are, Ginty obviously is better. But outside of him, the only running backs that are in Henderson's tier or better are Jeremiah Love for Notre Dame, maybe Jordan James and Nicholas Singleton from Oregon and Penn State, and maybe there's also Cam Scatterman. I mean, there are some pretty good running backs there. The point I'm trying to make is Henderson's a special player in his receiving capability, his rushing capability, and this is his best right now. This is the best season he's ever had in terms of caliber of player that he is. And they also have a good D-line. I mean, this D-line for OSU, I don't think is the nation's best. I don't think it's necessarily special, but it is deep, and it has a lot of great near-elite players on it. And I'm starting to think that based off the past 2 games that Sawyer, while not a unicorn, I'm beginning to think he's a special player. Like just that one step below unicorn. And that's very helpful to Jim Knowles and very useful. Sawyer's had an elite last 8 quarters of college football. So go Volunteers, go Buckeyes, and I'm looking forward to talking about Oregon versus Ohio State because that Rose Bowl game is going to be very special. All right, guys, I will be back really quick. I just clearly got to blow my nose, but then we'll talk for about 15, 20 minutes, a little bit of the Rose Bowl, a little bit of who I think the best teams remaining in the college football playoff are. I'll see you all very soon. All right, We are back. So, I want to talk about the Rose Bowl and the fact that I think it's going to be one of the better games in the college football playoff. I'm very excited to do a live stream for this game because I think this one is going to earn the channel a lot of views, a lot of money, plenty of different things, a lot of new subscribers as well, and hopefully some permanent, really passionate fans of not just college football, but the channel. So, let's start off right here. The Ohio State Buckeyes, in beating the Tennessee Volunteers, the Ohio State Buckeyes, in beating the Tennessee Volunteers, now travel to Pasadena, California to play the Oregon Ducks in the Rose Bowl. January 1st, 2025, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. local time in the Pacific Time Zone. Oregon, number 1, Ohio State, number 8. In reality, I think these are both top 3, top 4 teams at the bare minimum. This is kind of a blast from the past. Oregon, the best team in recent memory overall in the former Pac-12, as we once knew it and loved it. And Ohio State, in recent memory, and by recent memory I really mean the 2010s and forward, and maybe even the 21st century as a whole. The Ohio State Buckeyes, the best team in recent memory for the Big Ten over the past decade or so, playing in the Rose Bowl. This is it's absolutely incredible. So I want to talk about the fact that it will be cinematic and why it will be cinematic, and also talk about some matchups for both of these teams and give a little bit of an early preview and some of my thoughts. So make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the channel, to hit the notification bell, to comment your thoughts down below on this game, maybe an early score prediction if you've already thought that far ahead, and hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when my preview and prediction for this game drops in the next 48 hours. That is how quick I am going to make a preview and prediction video, and there will be, trust me, there will be several videos from this channel about this game because I'm excited for it, and therefore I want to give a few hours of my time throughout the week talking about it. So, first and foremost, I want to talk about an impactful matchup, and we'll go through 3 of these, and that will be the video. The impactful matchup that I'm looking at right here is Oregon's defense, but specifically their rushing defense against Ohio State's rushing offense. Ohio State against Tennessee showed some things that I haven't seen before. I haven't seen Will Howard run a speed option all that much this year. He ran it for, I think, maybe 1, 2, or 3 plays against Tennessee, had some success. Ohio State's offensive line is banged up, but I know that with Chip Kelly and also with Ryan Day's message about running the football, they want to run the ball. Travion Henderson had a good game, 2 touchdowns, averaged 8 yards per carry. Quinshon Judkins averaged 3.4 yards per carry against Tennessee. He had 2 rushing touchdowns. I wonder how this Ohio State offensive line and how their rushing attack now matches up against an Oregon rushing defense that has had some issues against Penn State, against Wisconsin, but also this is a healthier Oregon defense than what Ohio State faced off against when they played in Autzen. Remember, Ohio State's O-line in that game started off with both Seth McLaughlin and Josh Simmons. Now, in their places are Donovan Jackson and Carson Hinsman, who are not nearly as good as those two at left tackle and center, respectively. Jordan Burch wasn't playing in that game. He was injured, didn't take the field. Now he's healthy. So I'm curious to see how this matchup goes, what direction it takes. Does it turn left for Ohio State? Does it end up all right? Does Oregon potentially dominate here? Because remember, outside of some long runs by Henderson in that game where he had perfect blocking, Ohio State couldn't run the ball on Oregon outside of really 2 long runs. And now the O-line is more banged up, the run blocking is worse, and Oregon is theoretically better and healthier on the defensive front than they were on that game. So that's interesting right there. That's fascinating to me. Because yes, Ohio State did very well. They had an elite game against Tennessee, but Tennessee is not the same caliber of team that Oregon is, especially on the outside, at receiver, at quarterback, at corner, at safety. But I'd also say in the trenches, I think that Oregon's offensive line obviously is way better than Tennessee's, but I actually think their defensive line might be better too. So I'm curious to see the matchup between Chip Kelly and Ryan Day, Tosh Lupoy and Dan Lanning, how they scheme those two units. Oregon's defense for Lanning and Lupoy and Ohio State's offense for Kelly and Day, but also how these players match up strength on strength, speed on speed, acceleration on acceleration, decision on decision. Another impact matchup here, this is one that gave Ohio State's defense a lot of issues, is Oregon's passing offense and their pass protection unit against Ohio State's pass defense and their pass rush. Now, Ohio State's pass rush schematically has gotten better since that Oregon game because they've brought more pressure and they figured out that they can send blitzes, and their secondary is so good that they can send blitzes without incurring much of a risk of giving up a 3rd and long or giving up yardage. Instead, odds say when they blitz, they're going to get a sack rather than give up even a single successful play, whether it's a first down or just a few yards gained. But, again, they have not played a pass-blocking offensive line like Oregon since being in Autzen. Since that game where it was very good back and forth, I think it was the game of the year, and Ohio State tragically lost 32-31 in a game where Oregon could have won by double digits, but also Ohio State could have won by double digits. There's reason to have optimism that Ohio State's going to win in the rematch here. But in order to do that, or at least help their chances, they're going to have to get a better pass rush on a Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr. and go through them to get to Dylan Gabriel. They weren't able to, even when they blitzed against Oregon, and I'm curious to know how that would be different this time around. I think the most important thing here is not actually the pass rush against Gabriel. That's a big part of it. I think another critical piece to this is Ohio State's secondary, and if they're going to perform better in coverage, whether it's man on man or zone, are they going to perform better against these Oregon wide receivers and Oregon tight ends? Are they going to give up the same deep shots or easy checkdowns that they gave up in Autzen earlier in the year, where Ohio State's defense had their worst performance of the season? So that is another impactful matchup. Dylan Gabriel, Will Stein, Dan Lanning against really Jack Sawyer, I think the heart and soul of the defense and the best pass rusher on the team outside of maybe Cody Simon situationally, and Jim Knowles and Ryan Day. Oregon's passing offense and pass protection, which I think are the best in the nation when playing at a high level, against an Ohio State pass rush that can be lethal but is inconsistent, but also a safety room for Ohio State in Lathan Ransom, Caleb Downs, and Jordan Hancock that are the best in the nation. And last but not least, another impactful matchup here is Oregon's defense, their passing defense, their pass rush, their secondary, their pass coverage against Ohio State's passing offense. Will Howard, the running backs as well. Because don't forget, Travion Henderson's lined up at a receiver before and had success, and him and Judkins are pretty effective out of the backfield as last-minute options. And then also Ohio State's wide receivers and their offensive line. Oregon, even after Josh Simmons went down in the Oregon game, tragically, and I hope that he's able to heal up and do well in the NFL as he declared for the draft. Even after he went down and Zen Michalski was in, Oregon did not get a lot of pressure on Will Howard and on Ohio State. And that's because Ohio State's offensive line, without McLaughlin and without Simmons, is bad, sometimes terrible at run blocking. They're still anywhere from, at worst case, below average to at times good to great in pass blocking. This is a better pass blocking offensive line than run blocking offensive line. Oregon did not do a good job getting pressure on Drew Aller in Penn State in the Big Ten championship game. They struggled at other times getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks like Drew Lock, or Braden Locke, rather, not Drew Lock. Don't know why I got those names mixed up, but Braden Locke for Wisconsin. I'm curious to see how Jordan Birch, Mateo Uyungale, and Derek Harmon do against Donovan Jackson and Josh Fryer. Can they get pressure on Howard? Can Howard elude said pressure? And how do Oregon's DBs do against Jeremiah Smith, who they weren't really able to cover all that well? How do they do against Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, etc.? I'm so excited for this game. I truly think it is going to be cinematic. I think it is going to be one of the best, if not potentially the best matchups in terms of hype, but also in terms of on-field play in the college football playoff. I think it'll be back and forth. It'll certainly be close for 3 quarters. Maybe one team's able to pull away in the fourth quarter, maybe even in the third quarter, but I think for a half, it'll be very back and forth, and ultimately the team who I think makes the better halftime adjustments and the team who overall has the best win rate on an average basis through the air or through the trenches wins this game. Remember, in the Big Ten, we typically think of the trenches as the way to win. Both of these teams can negate that with the weapons that they have. We saw Oregon do it against Penn State, where Penn State won the trenches, but Oregon won the game. We've seen Ohio State do this at different times before, like against Georgia in 2022. They didn't win the game, but they won the air attack, and they consequentially led for much of the game by double digits. And this season, there were times where Penn State was equaling them or even winning against them in the trenches, but ultimately their offensive efficiency and their X-factor players on the outside helped them win in a way that Penn State couldn't really rely on. So I'm fascinated by this game. It's going to be a great one, and go Buckeyes and go Ducks, honestly. I'm happy for both of these fan bases, and I wish them success. Oh my goodness, my nose is pretty plugged up, guys. But the good news is, we're almost done here. We're almost done, and then we will yeah. Yeah, just had to blow my nose a bit there. Okay, but now what we're going to do, last but not least, is after I blow my nose, we're going to talk about some games. Not games, sorry. We're going to be ranking the 8 teams remaining in the college football playoff. I'll be right back. And welcome back, everyone. Okay. 10 minutes remaining. Glad that so many people are still on here. This is pretty incredible, honestly. All right, so let's talk about the best teams in the college football playoff. That's what I want to talk about now. Yeah. Okay. So just gotta do something quickly right here. No, I actually think we're oh no, crap. Sorry about this, guys. Okay. This is good. Okay. So, oh, are you kidding me? I didn't record any of this? That sucks. Wow. That is... oh boy. Okay. So, little bit of a down thing right here. My apologies on that. Gosh, that's frustrating. Okay, so we're just going to be done for the day. There's some technical difficulties that I didn't fully think through. Part of it might be because I'm sick. But we're just going to be done for the day. I'll see you guys soon on the next one. We'll actually be live tomorrow to preview these games and give a prediction. So I'll see you guys pretty soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.